Paris, autumn 1439. A pack of wolves is feeding on a corpse 3 blocks from Notre-Dame. They came in through a hole in the wall, a wall built 70 years earlier to keep enemies out. The leader is the size of a small horse, his fur stained rust red, his tail bitten off in some forgotten fight. The Parisians who survive him give him a name. They call him Courteau, Stubtail, and they paint warnings on the walls of the city. Beware Courteau. In a single week of September, his pack killed 14 people between Montmartre and the gates of Saint Antoine. Children dragged from doorways, women caught at dawn carrying water, an old man eaten on the steps of his own parish church. This is the largest city in Western Europe, the seat of kings, the home of the most prestigious university in Christendom. And on this winter night, it cannot keep wolves out of its streets.
I'm Arthur, and today we're reconstructing Paris during the worst 100 years it ever lived.
A century that began with a king who believed his body was made of glass and ended with a bridge full of houses collapsing into the Seine. Between those 2 moments, the city would be sold to a foreign king by its own queen. It would be massacred by its own butchers. It would burn the most famous girl in French history at the stake. And it would survive all of it. Because everything modern France would become, the centralized state, the standing army, the police, even the revolution that ended the monarchy 3 centuries later, was first written into the mud of these streets in blood that hadn't dried yet. This is the story of how Paris ate itself alive and how it learned to live with what it had become.
It begins with one man losing his mind in a forest.
August 5th, 1392. King Charles VI of France is riding through the woods near Le Mans at the head of his army when something inside his head breaks. A page boy drops a lance. The metallic clang triggers something in the king. He draws his sword, screams that he is being attacked by traitors, and charges his own knights. By the time his men can pull him down, 4 of his closest companions are dead, killed by their own sovereign. He is 23 years old. The doctors call it a fever. It is not a fever. For the next 30 years, Charles VI will drift in and out of madness. The chroniclers count 44 documented episodes. He forgets his own wife, then forgets that he has a wife at all. He forgets he is king. He believes his body is made of glass, that if anyone touches him, he will shatter. His tailors sew iron rods into his clothing to protect what isn't there. He howls in the corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Paul for hours. In January 1393, the court tries to distract him with a costume ball. 6 young noblemen, including the king himself, dress as wild men in costumes of linen soaked in pine resin and stuck with hemp to look like fur. Someone brings a torch too close. The resin ignites. 4 of the dancers burn alive on the floor in front of the entire court. The king survives only because his teenage aunt, the Duchess of Berry, throws her heavy blue skirts over his body and smothers the flames with her own dress. They will call it the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. The king who watched his friends turn into living torches will rule for another 29 years. When the king is glass, the kingdom shatters, and the first thing it broke wasn't a battlefield, it was the city itself.
A mad king cannot sign treaties. A mad king cannot lead armies.
So a vacuum opens at the center of France, and 2 factions move into it. On one side, the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother. On the other, the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, the king's cousin. In November 1407, John the Fearless has the Duke of Orleans assassinated in the streets of Paris by hired killers with axes. France falls into civil war between two cousins for the right to rule a kingdom whose king cannot remember his own face. In April 1413, the Burgundian faction makes a deal with the working-class districts of Paris. The butcher and tanner guilds rise up under a militia of skinners and craftsmen who wear white hoods and carry the tools of their trade as weapons: cleavers, skinning knives, meat hooks. They storm the Bastille, drag the royal provost from his cell, and execute him in the street. For months, the butchers terrorize the city, dragging nobles from their homes and putting them to death without trial. Then comes the worst news France has ever received. On October 25, 1415, on a muddy field at Agincourt, an English army less than a quarter the size of the French force annihilates the flower of French chivalry in a single afternoon. 6,000 French knights die, an entire generation of military leadership wiped out. France no longer has an army to oppose anyone. 3 years later, the door opens from inside. On the night of May 28, 1418, a young Parisian man named Perinet Leclerc steals the keys to the Porte Saint-Germain from his sleeping father, a city official, and unlocks the gates for a Burgundian army waiting outside. By dawn, 800 soldiers are loose in the streets. What follows is not a battle, it is a civic massacre. The Constable of France himself, Bernard VII of Armagnac, is dragged from his bed, beaten to death in the street, and the cross of Saint Andrew, the Burgundian emblem, is carved into his naked torso. In a single day, June 12, 1418, the chronicler known as the Bourgeois de Paris records 522 men killed and bodies, in his exact words, piled like bacon in the mud. The man leading the killing is the Paris executioner himself, a hooded figure named Capeluche, who walks the streets at the head of mobs of common citizens turned killers. He will eventually be beheaded by the same Burgundians who unleashed him, when even they can no longer control him. The killing finally stops, but the city's nightmare is just beginning. Because 2 years later, a French queen will sell her own kingdom to a foreign king.
2 years later, in May 1420, the Queen of France herself sells the kingdom.
Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of the Mad King, signs the Treaty of Troyes. Under its terms, her own son, the Dauphin, is declared illegitimate and disinherited. The crown of France is willed to Henry V of England. Paris becomes an English-occupied city under the regency of John, Duke of Bedford. In December 1431, a 10-year-old English boy named Henry VI is crowned King of France inside Notre-Dame Cathedral. 2 years before the coronation, in September 1429, a peasant girl from Lorraine had tried to stop all of this. Joan of Arc has already lifted the siege of Orleans. She has already crowned the disinherited Dauphin at Reims. She believes God has sent her to liberate the capital of France. On September 8, 1429, she leads 10,000 men against the walls of Paris at the Porte Saint-Honoré. She rides her horse into the moat in front of the pig market. A crossbow bolt punches through her thigh. Her standard-bearer is shot through the head when he raises his visor. And from those battlements, the citizens of Paris are screaming, "Death to the witch!" Because here is the part of the story most documentaries leave out. The ordinary people of Paris hated Joan of Arc. They were fanatically loyal to the Burgundian faction. They saw her as a heretic, a woman in armor, an instrument of the disinherited Dauphin who threatened their alliance with England. The assault fails. Joan is dragged off the field, the standard of France soaked in her own blood. 2 years later, when she is captured and put on trial for heresy at Rouen, the case against her is not built by English soldiers. It is built by the most prestigious institution in France, the University of Paris. The doctors of theology of the Sorbonne draft the 12 articles of accusation. The intellectual elite of the city she had tried to liberate writes the document that sends her to the stake. Bedford's Paris, meanwhile, is dying without her. 12,000 artisans flee the city. Trade collapses by 70%. The price of bread quadruples. The bourgeois of Paris records in his diary that people are dying without confession in the streets and being eaten by dogs. But the worst predator of all wasn't wearing English colors. It walked into Paris on 4 legs.
The winters of 1438 and 1439 are the harshest of the century.
Europe is sliding into what climate historians now call the Little Ice Age. The Seine freezes solid. Wood for fires is unaffordable for the poor. Bodies of the recent dead, those killed by famine and the plague that has returned again, lie stacked outside churchyards because the ground is too hard to dig graves. And the wolves come down from the forests. They have been feeding on battlefield corpses for 2 decades, the dead of Agincourt, the dead of the Civil War, the dead of every village burned by mercenary companies. By 1439, generations of wolves have grown up tasting only one kind of meat, human meat. They enter through breaches in the walls of Charles V, fortifications nobody has repaired since the occupation began. By night, they hunt in the empty districts where families fled the fighting. The chronicles record 60 to 80 victims in the city itself. In a single week of late September, the pack led by the giant tailless wolf the Parisians have named Courteau killed 14 people between Montmartre and the cathedral. Children dragged from cottages near the city wall, a woman fetching water at dawn, an old beggar caught on the steps of his parish church. The city paints warnings on walls, "Beware Courteau." 6 weeks later, in November 1439, the citizens organize. Hundreds of Parisians, armed with whatever they can carry, pitchforks, kitchen knives, paving stones, drive the pack toward the heart of the city. The wolves are cornered in the streets near the cathedral. They are clubbed to death where they fall. The body of Courteau, jaws forced open with a stick, is hauled in a wheelbarrow to the square in front of Notre-Dame and left there for everyone to see. What kind of city needs to display the carcass of a wolf like a fallen hero? A city where death has taken over architecture itself.
In the same years that the wolves are hunting in the streets, 2 waves of bubonic plague tear through Paris.
The epidemic of 1418 kills around 50,000 people. The wave of 1438 finishes off many of the survivors. The city has now lived through massacres, occupation, wolves, and plague, returning whenever it pleases. So Paris builds an architecture for the dead because it can no longer build one for the living. The Holy Innocents Cemetery, 2 blocks from the central market of Les Halles, has been receiving Parisian corpses for 9 centuries. It cannot keep up. Mass graves are dug in pits 2 meters wide and 10 meters deep, holding 1,500 bodies each. When the pits are full, the bones are dug up and stacked in open galleries along the cemetery walls. Tens of thousands of skulls and femurs arranged in plain view of merchants selling bread and cloth a few meters away. In the winter of 1424, during the darkest years of the English occupation, someone paints a mural along these galleries. Long rows of dancers, pope, king, merchant, farmer, child, each one taken by the hand by a grinning, decomposing corpse. They call it the danse macabre, the dance of death. It is a theological warning that the grave makes no distinction between the duke and the beggar. But in a plague-ridden city under foreign rule, the dead king being dragged into the earth is not an abstraction. It is a portrait of the world outside the cemetery walls. A short walk from the cemetery, on the right bank of the Seine, stands the Grand Châtelet, the fortress that holds the prisons of Paris. Inside it, 2 cells in particular are designed to kill. The first is called the fosse, the pit, an inverted cone hollowed into the rock, narrowing to a point at the bottom. A prisoner stands knee-deep in stagnant water mixed with sewage. Maximum life expectancy in the pit is 15 days. The second cell is called the fin des, the end of comfort, a cell flooded with rotting refuse, rats and reptiles. Death takes a little longer here, but it always comes. In the basement of the Châtelet, a long room holds the bodies of the unidentified dead pulled from the Seine. The jailers stand at the door and stare at each face. They morgue them in the old French verb meaning to look at with cold contempt, to memorize the features. From that verb, that room, that gesture, comes a word the modern world still uses: morgue. And on the northern outskirts, on a mound visible from the city walls, stands the Gibet de Montfaucon, the largest gallows in medieval Europe. 16 stone pillars 7 meters high, supporting a wooden lattice, 45 compartments, 45 bodies hanging at the same time, weather-blackened, picked at by crows, dropped through a trapdoor into a common pit when only bones remain. Death is not hidden in medieval Paris. It is the city's most visible resident. But beneath the surface of all this horror, ordinary Parisians are still doing what humans always do. Let me show you what that looks like.
Step into the streets of the Paris of the 1450s. The first thing that hits you is the ground. The streets are not paved with stone, they're paved with mud. The famous boue de Paris, a thick black sludge of human waste, animal droppings, and rotting market scraps that travelers across Europe knew by reputation alone. It smells of sulfur and excrement. People walk on raised wooden clogs to keep their shoes above it. By night, residents empty their chamber pots from upper windows after shouting the warning, "Gardez l'eau," watch the water, and the pedestrian below has 3 seconds to dodge. The second thing that hits you is Notre-Dame. Forget the gray stone cathedral on the postcards. The Notre-Dame of 1450 is painted. The statues in the Gallery of Kings are coated in yellow ochre, lead white, and a deep blue made from crushed azurite. The faces of the saints have rosy cheeks. The halos behind their heads are beaten gold leaf, polished so that at sunset, when the western light catches the facade, the heads of the saints appear to ignite in fire. If you have a few coins, you go to the étuves, the public baths, mixed bathing, men and women together, 6 deniers for entry. They're the only place in Paris where a noblewoman and a market porter sit naked in the same room and don't pretend the other isn't there. The church will close them by the end of the century when syphilis arrives from the New World.
If you have no coins, you live somewhere else, in the alleys behind Saint-Denis, in the streets the royal guard will not enter after dark, in the neighborhood the chroniclers called the Cour des Miracles, the Court of Miracles. Every morning, hundreds of beggars leave these alleys blind, crippled, or covered in sores. Every night they return, and they can see, they can walk, their skin is clean. The miracles happen in reverse. They chew soap to fake epileptic seizures in church doorways. They tie their legs behind their backs to pretend amputation. They smear pig blood on their faces to imitate leprosy. Charity is a path to salvation, the church teaches. They have turned it into an industry. And in the taverns of the Latin Quarter, drinking with thieves and forgers, sits the most brilliant poet of the French Middle Ages. His name is François Villon, Master of Arts from the Sorbonne in 1452. He kills a priest in a tavern brawl in 1455. He robs the treasury of the College of Navarre with a gang of criminals in 1456. He writes some of the most haunting verse in any language, the Ballade of the Hanged Men, from a death row cell in the Châtelet, addressing the corpses he expects to soon hang beside him. Brothers in humanity, he writes, who live on after us, do not harden your hearts against ours. His sentence is commuted to 10 years' exile. He walks out of Paris in 1463 and disappears from history. Nobody knows where or how he died. Paris had survived the King of Glass, the wolves, and the English, but the next ruler would be the most dangerous of all, because he had survived everything else.
November 12, 1436.
The Parisians themselves opened the Porte Saint-Jacques from the inside and let the army of Charles II into their city.
The English garrison surrenders without a serious fight. 16 years of foreign occupation end in a single afternoon. The same people who in 1436 had unlocked their own gates from within would, 3 years later, force the French nobility to accept something the kings of France had never been able to impose. At the Estates General of 1439, the Third Estate compels the nobility to consent to the taille, a permanent direct tax on the kingdom to fund a permanent royal army. In 1445, that army is born, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance. 20 companies, 100 lances each, 6 soldiers per lance, 12,000 professional salaried troops answering only to the king. It is the first professional standing army of Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Feudal warlords with private armies are about to become medieval history. 8 years later, that army wins France a war it had been losing for 116 years. On July 17, 1453, at Castillon in Gascony, 2 French engineers, the brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, deploy a new kind of weapon, mobile artillery. Cannons mounted on wheeled carriages, dragged into field positions instead of dragged to siege walls. The English army of John Talbot charges directly into 300 guns and is annihilated. The 100 Years' War is over. In 1470, 3 professors at the Sorbonne import a new German invention, a printing press. The first book printed in Paris is Les Grandes Chroniques de France, the history of the nation itself, as if the city knows that the story it has just survived needs to be written down before anyone could believe it. And then in 1461, the throne passes to a man unlike any French king before him, Louis XI. Court chroniclers will give him a nickname, the Universal Spider. He spins a web of spies, informers, and bribed courtiers across every court in Europe. He builds the first royal postal system, relay stations every 20 kilometers. He crushes the Duke of Burgundy in 1477 and absorbs his territories. Where Charles VI had seen himself as glass, Louis XI sees himself as a thread, invisible, unbreakable, everywhere at once. By 1499, the population has climbed back from 80,000 to 150,000. The bridges are being rebuilt. The Renaissance is arriving from Italy. The wolves are gone. The English are gone. The Mad King is a memory. The Cour des Miracles still operates, but its days are numbered. And then, on October 25th, 1499, with no warning, the Pont Notre-Dame collapses. 60 houses built on top of the bridge slide into the Seine. The medieval city of Paris ends, almost on schedule, with the falling of its own walls. Paris did not survive the 15th century because it was strong. It survived because every time it broke, every massacre, every famine, every winter with wolves inside the walls, its people put it back together. Not kings, not generals, butchers and bakers and boatmen and students, rebuilding with mud and blood and stone. Paris survived the wolves, but the wolves survived in Paris.
The story of Paris is about a city that was consumed by plagues and war, yet somehow survived.
But the story of Athens is the exact opposite, a golden empire that voted for its own downfall. If you want to understand how a civilization can conquer itself, watch the Athens video next.
And make sure to subscribe to Joan of Arc community. See you on the next journey.
Before we finish, I want to take a moment to recognize the people appearing on screen right now. To the members of this channel, thank you so much. Your ongoing support is what motivates me and helps keep this project alive. If you enjoy what we do here and would like to directly support the channel, I invite you to click the Join button down below. To our members and to everyone who is simply watching this video, thank you for your time.